This lecture is on salutary neglect. So, to define salutary neglect, we need to think of the status of England at this time in administering colonies and what was going on across the colonies and how England was responding to problems. So, if we go back to the founding of America, we know that the Pilgrims and the Puritans, the Virginia colony, they were established by charters. They were established by private companies that were authorized by the government, and the point was to make money. Once there was establishment of colonies, though, of settlement in these areas, the British government is going to assume control over the trade and the finances and the administration of the government, because these colonies, in essence, are just extensions of England, and therefore they need to be treated as if they're part of England. Although the citizens or the residents of these colonies won't be treated as equal as British citizens, the expectations that the British have for them will be treated as if they were British citizens. Now, what the Americans don't know is that the taxes and the regulations placed on people of England are so much greater than America will ever experience. Now, this is going to be one of the causes of the American Revolution, that by living in America, with the problems going on in England, and the way they maintain the colonies, living in America is so much better financially. You don't have to worry about the land issues in England. You don't have to worry about the high taxation. The laws themselves are not really regulated by England. So each of the colonies made up their own laws and really ran their own assemblies. Now, where does this actually come from? Well, in about the 1650s, England started realizing that they need to better regulate trade in order to make money. Because the issue was, we had talked about this in other lectures, that the French and the Dutch and the Spanish in the South were all in America as well. And they were an easy trade partner. So as things were being produced and raw materials were being collected in America, there was extra that could be traded with the French and the Dutch, and perhaps they would pay more. Well, the British didn't like this because the whole concept of mercantilism was that the colonies would get cheap materials and bring them to the British in order for them to turn a profit, not to make the most money they could. So in 1651, the British Parliament authorized the first Navigation Act. And the Navigation Act was just a fancy way of saying England only. You can only trade with England. You can only send your goods on English ships. It tried to really rein in a lot of what we would refer to almost as piracy. That people were going around the law and selling things illegally. And England was now trying to rein in on those people and say, if you do that, then you're going to be fined, punished, and possibly sent to jail. And in order to support this, England's going to fight a series of wars with first the Dutch, the Anglo-Dutch Wars from 1652 to 1674, which they're going to defeat the Dutch, which we had talked about the Dutch being kicked out of England, kicked out of the colonies, and York coming in and establishing New York. And then eventually they're going to go to war with the French. These wars are going to be fought based on trade, because they want to have a monopoly on trade in the New World and other colonies, and they want to push out the French and the Dutch. So England's doing a lot to support the American exploits, the American industry, and the American ingenuity in order to create new business. Now, all along, Americans are realizing, well, if I follow the law, yes, I'm going to be a good British citizen, but if I don't follow the law, am I going to be punished? So people start not following the law, not following these navigation acts. And by the time you get to the end of Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan dictator who dies and his son is overthrown, you're going to have a restoration of the monarchy. And first you're going to have Charles II, who's going to spend a lot of time trying to rebuild the strength of the monarchy. But his brother, James II, that Duke of York, who took over in New York, he is going to have been in exile in France during the Cromwellian period. And in France, he's going to look at the King of France as this amazing leader because he is an absolutist. The people look at him as almost a god. And James II, much in the same vein, is going to follow that idea when he becomes king. And one of his policies against America is to revoke the charters of Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island and New Hampshire and New York because they're not following British way of life. They're not following the rules. They're not adhering to the king's orders. So he revokes their charters. He sends in a new governor, Edmund Andros, and establishes a unitary state called the Dominion of New England. He does this in 1686. And for 3 years, these colonies are united as one under this governor, Edmund Andros, who does run sort of a police state and tries to rein in on the piracy and the illegal actions of people who are not following the law. And then James II is not very popular. He's a Catholic, so they don't really want him to be king. They don't want his heirs to be king. So they overthrow him, and they replace him with James's daughter, who did convert. She was a Protestant, and she marries this guy from Holland, the Netherlands, the Dutch. So this guy, he's a Prince of Orange, and his name is William. So William of Orange becomes William III, King of England, being a Dutch prince. But he's married to Mary, who's the daughter of James II. And they rule together as William and Mary. You may have heard of the College of William and Mary in Virginia. That's where they get that name. And in this glorious revolution, which is a bloodless revolution because there's not really a war fought over it, William and Mary, they undo a lot of the dictator ideas that Cromwell had and that Charles and James continued with, and they accepted this idea of constitutional monarchy. So for the first time, under the Glorious Revolution, England, as the king, the position of king is becoming less and less powerful, and Parliament is rising in its power. So as a result, you start to see lax political oversight of the New World, because the new king really is not going to send in his hounds in order to rein in on things because he wants to be well respected. And he's not going to focus on the colonies. As long as the colonies are following the basic laws and he's not losing a ton of money, he's not going to go out of his way, the new king and queen, to administer these laws. So during this time, Americans become a lot more self-sufficient. They don't have to worry about oversight. They don't really have to follow British laws. Yes, there's some administration of the Navigation Acts, but overall, these Navigation Acts are not being followed, which is leading to lack of revenue for the British. But there's no civil war going on. There's no war against there's no rebellion against the British king because the Americans are pretty much happy. They're left alone. And in this system, they're able to form their own way of doing things. They have their own taxation. They have their own paper currency in each of the colonies. They're basically doing things that really only the British Crown can authorize. But since there's not a lot of oversight, there's not really a reason not to do these things, to function as an individual state. So each of the colonies starts functioning like its own country. And over time, this becomes something that people really own. I'm not a British colonist, I'm a Massachusetts man. That's my homeland. Yes, I'm British, but really Massachusetts is my country. That's what I have an allegiance to. There's no allegiance to the American colonies, there's an allegiance to the place you come from. This is where we start to get this whole idea of states, and how the reason when we form a United States, we keep these states, because these states are the very essence of our identity, which is a topic we could talk about later of why are states so important? Why do each state have its own laws and its own way of doing things? And in one state, you can have gay marriage, in another state you can't, even though it's changing at this point. Why do we have such divisions between each of the states? It goes back to this essential question, this identity of Americans, that their state is just as important as their federal government. So at the end of William and Mary's reign, William and Mary die, and they're replaced by Anne, Mary's sister. And Anne never gets married, she has no heirs, and when she dies, there is no one to replace her to become the next king of England. So they go looking throughout all of the distant relatives of the British monarchy. They don't find anybody in England, so they have to end up going to the German states. And in the German states, there is a duke of a place called Hanover, and his name is Georg, or George as we know him. And George, a German duke, ends up being appointed as king of England. So now you have this unified government between the Duchy of Hanover and the Kingdom of England form as one. So this King George becomes King of England and King of Hanover. Now, as this is going on, King George's German doesn't speak English. He appoints Sir Robert Walpole, who becomes the first technical Prime Minister of England. And the only reason they even create this position of Prime Minister is because the king can't really communicate as well as he should be able to. So Robert Walpole does a lot of the talking for him. And Walpole forms this Tory party, or is part of this Tory party, which supports the king. Now, one of the problems that Walpole does when he becomes the prime minister is he starts to make political appointments. Typically, that was the power of the king. And the political appointments he makes are his friends and his cronies. And these people don't really necessarily know how to best run a country. And as a result, some of the people he appoints, like the Board of Trade in the American colonies, is not doing its job very well. As a result, there's more salutary neglect. There's more neglect of taking care of the financial issue going on in the colonies. So the colonies is bleeding the British government because they've spent all this money on forming these colonies, sending over supplies, fighting wars in order to defend the trade, and they're not really making a profit as much as they could be off of the colonies. So when you get to the end of George II's reign, this is when you're going to get closer to the reigning in of the colonies. George II, George I's son. Now, George II's son is going to be George III, the king during the Revolutionary War, one of the longest-serving kings of England's history. And under George III, there's going to be an immediate rise of these prime ministers who come up with new taxes in order to rein the Americans back in and say, we are the British Crown, we have the authority, your local authority is not as important as the British Crown. Now, after 50 to 100 years of this salutary neglect, most state assemblies believe that their authority is more powerful than the British Crown. That yes, they inherently get power from England, but they run themselves. They are more of a local power. They know what's best for them. They know how to tax their own people. And why should they ascribe to the power of the Parliament, which is a thousand miles away, the Atlantic Ocean, who's telling them what to do when they don't have really any representation in Parliament? Their representation is here in the colonies. The governor who represents England in these colonies is never looked at as an equal to any of these local people because they're appointed by an unknown, unfamiliar system. So when you think of salutary neglect, part of the American identity, as we have looked at other things in this course, is about choice, is about freedom, is about the ability to choose what makes sense to you. And now to be imposed by a foreign authority, it's foreign to most colonists because they've never been to England. They don't really consider themselves English. They're colonists who live under the English power. And now they're being told they have to pay additional taxes. They have no representation in this national parliament. And when we think of why the Revolutionary War hurts people so much, why people so impassioned to fight for their rights, is because truly, although they were not an independent nation, they had been acting as independent states for 50 to 100 years prior to this French and Indian War that's going to, for the first time, really unite all the colonists together. And to now be told that they are an entity that has to all act the same, has to be following the British laws, is gut-wrenching to most Americans. And it'll be a reason to unite them together against the British because they all want this independence to be able to continue the way they did things for the past 100 years without the intervention of the foreign power. And if England is not going to allow them to keep their independence, their so-called independence under these colonial assemblies, they will fight for their rights in order to make up for these 100 years of salutary neglect.